you're visiting with us this morning, it's good to have you here. I'm Andrew. I'm the associate pastor here at Brightview Church. Pastor Chris, along with a number of others in our church who have been going through a leadership program, are away this weekend at a leadership retreat. Although we should probably call it like a leadership fellowship, leadership camp. You don't want to call it a retreat because leaders shouldn't retreat, right? Like we don't run away, we lead. It's a bad joke. Okay, sorry. It's Father's Day. I thought I'd try a dad joke or two. I'm also going to apologize in advance here. Friday night was our last youth night, so I did a lot of yelling while we threw over 3,000 water balloons at each other. And yesterday was a soccer tournament, and I coach, and so I did a lot of yelling there as well. And by last night, I had no voice left. I'm fortunate this morning, after some warm lemon tea and a couple spoonfuls of honey, that I have a voice again, but I apologize if it squeaks a bit like a prepubescent teenage boy. It might happen. Anyways, we'll try our best. Over the last few weeks, Pastor Chris has been going through sort of a bit of a break from the Sermon on the Mount to explore some of the attributes of God, to remind us of who God is, and not just simply the works that are described in the Sermon on the Mount. But instead, we want to look for a short time at the character of the God who prescribes that lifestyle. And so, with Chris away this week, he asked me to fill in and do one of his, a sermon in his series. So I'm taking a break from the solas, and I'll come back to those in the summer. So come in August to hear me speak on the final two of the 5 solas that I've been working through. This morning we're looking at God transforms. And there's a lot of areas in the Bible we could go to look at transformation and at the idea of God's transforming work. But I decided I'd do something maybe a little different than I normally do when I preach. Or maybe it's actually what I normally do when I preach. I don't really know. But a little bit different. We're going to focus on just 2 verses for the whole sermon. So we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into 2 verses in the Bible, 2 that are probably very, very well known, verses you've probably heard and maybe even quote regularly, especially when you're talking about transformation. And that's Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Reads like this. Therefore, brothers and sisters, in view of the mercies of God, I urge you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true worship. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. That's really hard for me to read in this version because I memorized it in a different version. I kept wanting to change the words there. We're going to focus in on these 2 verses. Now, there's other very important related verses. We're going to be jumping a tiny bit over to Galatians to look at the fruit of the Spirit. We'll jump a little bit to 2 Corinthians, which was just read out loud by Brian. 2 Corinthians 5 almost directly connects with this. This is like the same teaching from Paul, just in 2 different letters. But these 2 verses summarize the teaching on God transforming people. It brings it all into one really concise package. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. I want to make one more note there before we really dig in. We want to make sure we don't fall into the error of this age, which is to add the perfect will of God for you. Does not say for you at the end of that verse. We are talking about God's will, his will over all things, not our independent destiny. What's God's will for me in my life? That's not what this is about. That's being caught up in the pattern of this age, and we'll get to that in a moment. So let's be careful with that. So many of us have probably heard this passage, read it many times, maybe quote it frequently. I certainly do. I learned it as a teenager, and it's been stuck in my head ever since. And I like to quote it at people who I think are conforming. I rarely quote it at myself. And I do more now, but I used to not. because I thought everyone else was the problem and not me. I required some transformation. But let's begin at the beginning of this verse. Therefore, brothers and sisters. So therefore is a really important word. When you see the word therefore at the start of a sentence, it means whatever was said beforehand matters to this passage. So we're not going to go back and read everything in chapter 11. Basically, chapter 11 can kind of be summed up like this. Paul says, if you're disobedient, that's sin, okay? Your disobedience, your sin, requires justice, and justice equals death. And Paul actually goes into this whole thing about how the disobedience of all of the Gentiles is the reason why the Jews are given mercy, because they also would be disobedient if not for God revealing himself to them and giving them the opportunity for mercy. So he says disobedience or sin requires justice, and justice requires death. But then Paul continues in that same chapter and he says, however, because of Jesus, now disobedience is met with mercy, and mercy brings life. He actually adds one extra step. Mercy brings grace, and grace gives life. Okay, God's grace gives life. So disobedience and sin actually results in mercy. God's mercy, because of our disobedience, he is able to give us mercy. Grace through mercy then results in our having life and not death, which is what we deserve. Therefore, in light of God's mercy, or in view of God's mercy, so in knowledge that our sin means that God can give us mercy and that really without it we have death, we are then to do what? Give ourselves as living sacrifices. So death is where we're headed. Death is actually where we are without God's mercy. Right? Disobedience, rebellion. I had to explain this at youth group this past Friday because I kept getting questions about how sin and grace kind of function. That's not really how the questions were worded, but that's kind of what they were really asking. And so I had to keep explaining that basically humanity is in a constant state of rebellion against God. And we are born into the rebel tribe of humans who are in rebellion against God, okay? From Adam and Eve, they rebelled against God and they were kicked out of God's presence, out of the Garden of Eden, and became rebels against the state or against the king of the universe. We all now live in that place of rebellion. That rebellion we call disobedience. Disobedience is the direct translation of the word sin, okay? So sin literally means to disobey or to be in rebellion. Okay, so when we are rebelling against God, we live in sin, and every one of us lives amongst the rebellious and are ourselves rebellious against God, the King of the universe. And so God has determined that rebels, and this is a standard concept in even human monarchy, if you're a rebel, the proper punishment is death because you stand against the king. And the proper and just punishment for those who are in rebellion against God is death. However, through Jesus, through God's mercy, we receive grace and through that life. And God gives mercy to those whom he chooses to give mercy to. Jew or Gentile, which is a big deal for Paul. It means you don't have to have a certain bloodline or come from a certain family to receive mercy from God. God gives mercy to those whom he chooses to give mercy to. And in doing so, he buys your life. No longer do you deserve death, but you actually have the opportunity at life now, but you owe that life debt, as it were, to God. Okay? You would be dead, but he stepped in your place, paying for your life with his own. So now we owe him our lives. And some of us take that and go, well, I've got my life back. I'm going to use it however I want. But what Paul encourages here is he says, I urge you to present yourselves as a living sacrifice, as if your life is sacrificed to God. The one who bought your life, now you sacrifice it to him, submitting your will, submitting your desires, submitting your passions to his. No longer are you to live for yourself, but to be living for God, dedicating fully to him. These two verses summarize God's call to transformation, but this is a hard teaching. Paul urges the believers to sacrifice themselves and live entirely dedicated for God. And this was not simply a call for the Pharisees or missionaries or pastors. This wasn't a call just for those who would enter into full-time ministry. This is a call to every person who would claim the name of Christ, to every person who has been given mercy and life through Christ, is now to sacrifice all that they would normally live for, all of their will and desires, and follow Jesus with it. Set aside your demands, your desires, and even your freedoms. As if dead to the world, sacrificed fully to God in gratitude for his mercy. And it says this is truly an act of worship. This is your true worship. Well, what is worship? Worship is a response to something. Worship is when something or someone does something you think is worthy of being honored, elevated, or made known to others. You respond in such a way to that person in order that they might be known. That's worship. So perhaps you really enjoyed a band and you want everyone to know about them. Well, you're going to talk about them to other people. You're going to recommend that band. You're going to elevate that band. I have an author who I really enjoy right now, a nonfiction author who writes really good, like Lord of the Rings style, but better. Oh, I can't believe I just said that. Lord of the Rings style, like fantasy novels, really epic adventures. The pacing is kind of better than Lord of the Rings. I really love Lord of the Rings, but it's really good. So I like to talk about this author and his writing, and I like to recommend it to others, right? And in a sense, in some small part, I'm making his name greater, and in a certain sense, that's an act of worship towards that author. And I think in a certain sense, we could follow that logically to say that's an act of sin, potentially, rebellion against God. But let's not go down that rabbit trail right this moment. What Paul says here, though, is that when we sacrifice ourselves, our lives, our desires, and our demands, our lives, and we live sacrificially to God for the sake of God, we make his name greater. We act out true worship. Where the one who is promoted is not my name, but God's name. Where the one who is honored is not my work, but God's work. Where the one who is glorified, who is made great, is not me, but him. And so living as sacrifices, this is a true act of worship. I no longer live for my will or my life, but for God. That makes God look really good. Or it should make God look really good. But the problem would be, it wouldn't make God look quite as good if I'm just living like the rest of the world around me. And so Paul says, do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world. Do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world. Now, my translation didn't actually say pattern. It just says, do not be conformed to this age. But I believe the King James says pattern of this world. And I really like that wording. And if Kirk was here, he'd be cheering right now because I said that. Kirk always comes and tells me I'm using the wrong translation because it's not King James. So it's a little inside joke. It's quite fun. He's wrong, but it's fine. Do not be conformed to this age, to this world. What is the pattern of this world? See, the pattern of this world is not just some ancient thing or the being conformed to this age. This wasn't just a command or a warning for ancient times. It's an issue today. There is pattern to the way our world functions. Right now in North America, more than any other time in history, we are pushing a value of autonomy, meaning who I am is the highest value for me to worry about. The individual freedom, individual will, individual rights, individual enjoyment, that is the highest value ethically, morally, personally. That's what everything needs to go into. So we push autonomy. Who has authority in your life? In our world today, it's only me. Like, I don't have authority in your life. In a biblical view, yes. But I mean, in our culture, it would be that I only have authority in my own life. No one else has the authority to say anything to me or tell me what to do or how to live. That's autonomy. But the pattern of this world, how strongly we see it today, this self-centered, subjective view of myself. And if the autonomous declarations of myself are challenged, then the challenger is in the wrong and they're morally evil and corrupt for telling me how to live. And they should be made subject to me, which is self-defeating, but people don't see that. This pattern is so strong in our culture, but it's not new to our culture. It's a selfishness, it's a self-centeredness, it's an autonomy, but it's not new. So the pattern began with Adam and Eve, who in the garden, as they are told, don't eat this one fruit. But Eve sees the fruit. And yes, she is tempted by a serpent, by the seraph. That's the actual word there, a seraphim, named Lucifer is what we call him, or Satan, the adversary. But what actually catches her in the temptation is not just Lucifer. She sees that the fruit is pleasing to the eye, will be good to taste, and will give her knowledge. It was attractive to her eyes. It was going to benefit her stomach. It was going to make her smarter. And you can't tell me those temptations aren't the same ones we face all the time. That looks good to me. I want that. Oh, that's going to taste delicious. I got to eat that. I would love to be smarter than everybody in the room. I definitely want to be more intelligent. I'll pursue that. Those temptations persist to this day, and they are rooted in selfishness. They are rooted in pursuing oneself and making oneself greater. It carries on. Cain and Abel. Abel was blessed by God. Cain was not. Well, how do we fix that? There's only 2 sons. Well, if I kill one, then God will have to bless me because he has no other options. Just kill off a quarter of the world's population, and suddenly I'm worthy of a blessing. Maybe. Maybe that's not what he was thinking. He was just angry, it seems. And yet it continued. The selfishness, the anger, the rage. God would choose you over me? That seems wrong and unfair. Why didn't God choose me? It should be about me. And so he lashes out in anger. The pattern persists throughout the book of Genesis and on through the whole Old Testament. I could go on with stories in your notes. I listed a handful of them just off the top of my head. It took me like 2 seconds to think of those stories. Up here, I've got a picture of Israel worshiping the golden calf while Moses brings down the 10 Commandments. Like, what foolishness and selfishness of the Israelites. If we look at that story, we're like, how could they be so dumb? There was this big cloud over the mountain that was clearly God's presence, and they still decided to worship a golden cow right at the foot of the mountain? Like, what were they thinking? They were caught up in the pattern of this world of selfishness, of focusing on one's own desires and will, and rebellion against God. And the pattern continues through the New Testament, Judas and betraying Jesus. And it continues on throughout all of human history with broken families, with self-centeredness, with corruption, poor governments, with war and violence, with people pursuing, this is why I don't like using these things. Could you back it up? There we go. Thank you. Oh. I don't know how this thing works. You want to just press down arrow. There we go. Thanks. With people pursuing their own crown. Good time for a quick drink break. So we've got to cut to like those colored bars and be like, we're having some technical difficulties. Please stand by. Teenagers won't understand that reference because they don't have TV anymore. They just stream it. No, that's just a screen. I mean, like, never mind. We're not going to get into this right now. They already called me old once today. The pattern of this world is the constant pursuit of making for yourself your own kingdom. Usurping the throne of God for yourself. Placing yourself on the seat of authority and power to rule over all that you think you deserve to rule over. It's seeking your own crown by walking on others and by ignoring or rebelling against God. The pattern of this world is ultimately selfishness. It is the opposite of sacrifice. Sacrifice says, not my will, but your will. But the pattern of this world says, my will over your will. Selfishness does not glorify God, it glorifies self. Sacrifice does not glorify self, it really glorifies God. We are called to be living sacrifices. And for that reason, Paul declares, do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world. Do not be conformed to this age. This place in this world of people who seek only for themselves. You have been conformed since childhood. You were born into a world of selfishness, and you are being taught to be selfish in your schools, in your social clubs, in your sporting events, in your workplaces, on social media, from the TV and movies that you watch. You have been conformed, and you are being conformed constantly to the pattern of this world. Being told that you deserve more, that you're entitled to more, that you're special just the way you are and you have no need for change. And a curse be on anyone who would tell you otherwise. You've been told that you are the highest moral authority for your own life. You have been conformed from birth, and you are conforming to this day to the pattern of this world. And every part of our culture is focused on that purpose. Maybe not out in the open. Maybe they don't say that's their reason, but that's what's happening. And yet we are to somehow be living sacrifices, not living for ourselves, when everyone and everything around us tells us we are. We are to die to ourselves. Why? Because God has shown mercy and given us undeserved life. So then we must not be conformed. Instead, we are to be transformed to a new way of thinking and a new way of living. Yeah, that's fun. A new way of thinking and a new way of living by the renewing of our minds. For the past several months, Pastor Chris has been working slowly through the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is one of the most profound and incredible teachings of Jesus. It's one of the places where if someone says, well, Jesus just taught good moral things, they'll often go to the Sermon on the Mount, and then you can go there too and go, well, actually, he taught things like love your enemy. How are you guys doing at that morally, in this world? He taught things like don't be anxious about anything because God will provide all your needs. Wow, that's a pretty intense thing to be told. Wow, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek and the humble. These are teachings that are radical, not just good moral teachings. But sometimes it can seem like a bit of a long list of to-dos. Oh, don't hate. Don't lust. Don't pray for making yourself seen. When you fast, make sure to wash your face. Okay, when you pray in this very specific way of praying, and don't steal from people. And make sure to love your enemy. And if someone hurts you, then you're supposed to let them hurt you more. And it's like a list of things to do. And I think sometimes we see this as a bit of a chore list. And there's other places we can see similar chore lists in the Bible. For example, the fruit of the Spirit is one of those fancy chore lists. I find this one gets thrown at me because I'm a Christian, so it gets thrown at me. But they get it backwards, and we're going to get into that. They're thrown at me like, okay, well, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Okay, well, you're a Christian, so you better be loving. Well, Andrew, that wasn't very loving by my standard of loving, and so you better be more loving to prove yourself a Christian or something. Wow, Andrew, you're upset. I thought you were supposed to have joy all the time. What kind of Christian are you? Put your joy out front. Okay. I go back to that song from Sunday school, the joy deep down in my heart. Joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Where? Okay. They don't usually let me sing, so, got 2 seconds. Why not? It's like a big to-do list. The Sermon on the Mount can be a bit of a to-do list. And we look at it and we're like, man, we got to do all these things. And if I maybe act the right way, eventually it'll start to be the right way. There's this idea about if I can get the right behaviors, then maybe eventually I'll start getting the right attitude. This is actually something our world teaches. It even teaches this to my children at school. I have to talk to them afterwards about, yes, behavior matters, but we're not into behavior modification. We want to see heart transformation. Okay, that's my fancy phrasing for this exact verse. We tend to focus on the behaviors, and if you act the right way long enough, maybe you'll start to think and be the right way. Right? Fake it till you'll make it. Fake it till you make it. Yeah, that's the one. You act and you behave and you do all the right things. And maybe eventually it'll actually sink in and become right. And we do the same thing with our Christian life sometimes. We're like, hey, a Christian's supposed to be loving and have joy and peace and patience. Okay, well, I'll just fake it till I make it. I'll just start acting out all those things, and maybe eventually I'll actually believe that I do love these people. Or maybe I'll just, look at the Sermon on the Mount and I'll just kind of do these things, and won't that earn me salvation, or won't that be enough to please God? As if anything I could do would please him on its own. I think we frequently get this in the reverse order, where we focus on the behaviors of the Christian, and we do as much as we can to put forward the right behaviors and the right actions. And I know there's a lot of pastors who do this, myself being one of them for a long time. But there's many pastors who I've seen who do this for a long time, and then they eventually crumble. Oftentimes their crumble is just a burnout, and they have to step away from leadership. Sadly, there are some who crumble or burn out in very public and very destructive ways. We simply cannot live long-term acting like we believe something, acting like it's actually real, and yet never being transformed in the heart. So we get it backwards. We do the behaviors first and hope that that results in transformation. But we've got it backwards. It's transformation that results in the changing of the heart. I have a little story about this. I'm skipping a part of my notes. That's okay. I have a little story about this. And maybe I talk about this too much. I asked David, do I talk about this too much? He said probably. So I'm going to put it in anyways. A couple of years ago, 4 years ago or so, some of you will know that I went through a bit of a process here at Brightview. I had been here for 3 years at the time, and some comments had been made about me that I think were true, very true, that I was a very good program director, but lacking something in terms of being a pastor. That I was a solid program director, had a cool youth group, great program, but lacking something that really needed to be there if I was going to have the title pastor. And I struggled with that, and I fought against that, and I disagreed with that at the time. Eventually, some things came up and came to a head, and I was called out and asked to go through a process of discipleship. Now, the church never said they were going to fire me, but I felt very close to that place, and I actually almost walked away and left. I felt so beat up and like I was being bullied. In reality, I was simply being called to be a pastor and be more than a program director. My pride and my arrogance stopped me at first from submitting to this, but eventually, after talking to one of my mentors, he said, it sounds like you've got a really good team of elders and leaders who want to see you grow. Most pastors in your position would have already been fired. And I said, wow, that hit pretty hard. So I said, okay, well then let's see what happens. So I submitted to our leadership here, and I submitted to a process of transformation or discipleship, which resulted in some transformation. I won't go into too much details about all what went on, but major thing that had to happen for me was I had to sacrifice my will and my pride. And now I would say I'm still in this process of transformation and discipleship, which is a process that will probably go on the rest of my life and probably goes on for the whole life of any believer who submits themselves to being a disciple of Christ. But one of the ways that I saw this transformation happen most was one of the interesting ways in which I saw this transformation happen was in an area of my life that I never really thought I would see a change, and doesn't have anything to do with being a pastor, very interestingly. It has to do with this. When I was about 21 years old, in the height of my arrogance and pride, just finishing up my master's degree, pretty sure I was God's gift to ministry, I had a friend who was studying kinesiology, and he had written up a workout program. And he said, I need a volunteer, a guinea pig, to help me test out this program. So I said, okay, let's go. I'll go to the gym. I've never really done that. I'll learn from you. Teach me what you know. Let's go work out together. The first week, it was a 3-day-a-week program. So it was supposed to be like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then you take the weekend off, then Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and work out 3 times a week. So we go for the first week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I'm crushing it, except for the fact that I'm in excruciating pain and I can't barely move anymore. So I'm dying after the first week. Second week, I sleep in on the Monday and don't go. I go Tuesday, Wednesday, and I'm still kind of dying. Third week, I sleep in all of the days, completely ignore his phone calls. He even came to my house one day and knocked on the door. I told Kathleen to tell him I was sick. I wasn't going to the gym. I was just done. I felt like just dying. The fourth week, he stopped trying to get me to go. And I never went back to the gym. I shouldn't say never. I did not go back to the gym after that for a long time. And now going to the gym is not a definition of a transformed heart. But what's interesting is that I was trying to do a behavior, and my motivation was simply just because I figured I could. There was no real drive. There was no real heart behind it. And so when things got tough, I gave up. Things got tough the very first day. It was terrible. If you've been to a gym, worked out at all, or just had a really hard day of work in general. I was a pastor and a student at a Bible school. I hadn't done anything physically demanding in ages. It was very painful. Interestingly, after this process of transformation and discipleship that I've been going through here at Brightview, about 2 years ago, I was running around with the youth group and ran out of breath in like 5 minutes. And I was like exhausted and done. And I'm like, why can't I chase down a teenager and destroy them anymore? I used to be so good at that. You know, give me a pool noodle and just beat kids with pool noodles because it doesn't show any marks and it doesn't really hurt, but it's really fun and really helps relieve stress. No, okay, that's not what I'm doing, but you know, like I'm supposed to be chasing and tagging kids during this game and I can't catch any of them, even the small ones. You know, like the weak ones that you separate from the herd and you hunt them down. I had to revert to ambush tactics. So I'm like hiding behind doors and waiting for kids to come around. I'm like, what's happened to me? I used to be in good shape and I used to be able to chase kids down. I was a terror on the capture the flag field. So I thought I should probably go to the gym. Now I didn't have a friend studying kinesiology, but David goes to the gym. So I was like, hey, you can show me stuff. So he showed me how to use some of the machines and I started going to the gym. And strangely, it hurt a lot. That wasn't the strange part. It hurt a ton. But what was strange was that didn't demotivate me. 10 years ago, I felt a little pain and I quit. Now, going through a time of discipleship where my heart had changed, I was no longer about how I felt or what was the right thing. I was motivated to get myself in better shape for a number of reasons, and not one of them being, I want to be able to continue to run my youth group for their sake, not my sake. I want to be healthy enough that I can still be their youth pastor in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I also want to be healthy enough to be my kid's dad for the next 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Oh, it's a long time being a dad. Diaper phase is over though. Sorry, those of you who aren't past that yet. Whew, that was the roughest for me, diaper phase. But my heart had changed. Going to the gym wasn't an act of self-improvement anymore for the sake of pride or arrogance or to show off. And then as soon as I met hardship, I quit. I started eating healthier. I've started going to the gym and getting healthier. This came from a transformed heart around what really matters in life. Not my health, though my health matters. But if I'm not able to be a little bit more healthy, I might not be able to be this youth pastor for these teenagers in another couple of years. If I don't do something about my health, I'm not going to be able to care for my kids in a couple of years or be there maybe at their wedding when they get old enough for that. Why do I do this to myself? Oh, they're only 9. Never going to happen. They're not allowed to grow up. Just kidding. They're getting there. I'm really proud of them. They're killing it at soccer this weekend. My point isn't everyone should go to the gym. That's not my point. So if you're hearing that, don't hear that. My point is that often we put the actions or the behaviors of what we think is right and hope that that will result in us becoming that thing. But the biblical view is that these actions and behaviors come out of a heart that's been changed. We actually need a renewing of our mind by the work of the Holy Spirit, not by our own efforts. I will never be able to love enough that I become loving. Rather, God must renew my mind and my heart to be one that loves others. Then, flowing outward from that, I can love. I cannot be motivated to do to love my enemy in such a way that if he demands my coat, I give him my shirt as well. Sure, I could do those actions, but am I actually being loving to that person? My mindset, my heart may not be loving unless God himself transforms my heart to be loving. The Sermon on the Mount is not a to-do list for us. It is the result of the transformed heart or the renewed mind. I cannot be a living sacrifice who gives up my will, my life, my goals, my passions, the demands that I have for my own freedoms or whatever else. I cannot be one who lives sacrificially unless God transforms my mind and my heart so that I can do so honestly. This is what 2 Corinthians 5:17 is saying. You are a new creation in Christ. The old has gone, the new has come. We are transformed by the renewing of our minds and no longer conform to the selfishness of this world. We live for God's kingdom, for God's crown, to make him look good, not myself. We are people who have lived according to the destructive patterns of this world for a long time. We are a culture that has embraced the patterns of this world for a long time. It's like we're trees that have been bearing fruit of rejection, pride, and rebellion. And God can prune these things away. He can give us new roots. He can refresh us with streams of living water. But as anyone who has tended to trees or plants knows, that once you've done the pruning and the root work and the fresh water, some initial changes will be obvious right away. But if we're going to see the tree bear fruit, it takes time. And so my last note here is that transformation takes time. You have been conformed to this world for a long time, and it'll take time for new growth, new life, and transformation. Sadly, during the time in which we see a pruned tree begin to regrow, sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes we don't see them last. Sometimes that tree dies. Now, we're not trees, but we are to bear fruit, and we're to bear the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. This comes from a healthy tree, a tree with renewed life, with life coming from streams of living water, with roots that feed in the Word of God, with a heart that has been transplanted. Oh, now I'm mixing analogies. That has been transplanted with the heart of God. This is the work of the Spirit. This is God's work in us. God transforms us. So what then are we to do? Do we just sit back and wait? Do we just sit in our chairs and go, oh, I'm not transformed enough yet, so I can't do anything? Hang out in the lazy boy chair. This is what I grew up with. Lazy boy chair, you pull it back, feet up, and you just wait. God will transform me. It's his work, not my work. What are we to do? No. No, we are to be presenting ourselves as a living sacrifice, giving our bodies, our time, our energy, our will to God. For me, it was a big submission of pride and a big submission of perceived authority. 4 years ago, in some ways I was forced to it. I'm very, very happy for it now. That I had to submit my pride. And I remember the day I maybe took the first step of submission. After the church leadership confronted me and said, there's some serious changes that need to happen in your life. And we don't know exactly how that looks because it's God's work, not our work. And so you need to take some steps back from leadership and work on that stuff. I remember that day I went to my office afterwards and everyone had cleared out of the church. And I was sitting in my chair and I couldn't sit there. So I fell onto the floor on my knees, face in the smelly carpet. I've talked about this before. The carpet was terribly smelly. I vacuumed it shortly afterwards. But in that moment, it didn't matter because I was on my knees, face on the floor, and I just started weeping and crying out to God. And at first I was angry. God, why would you do this to me? I thought you wanted me in ministry. Why would you do this? I thought you equipped me. I thought I was good enough. Am I not good enough for you? And then he broke me down. And I remember the end of that prayer was, I'm in the wrong. I'm sorry. I'll submit. I'll follow. Where would you have me go? And over the course of that year, I experienced some pretty cool transformation. But it wasn't because of anything I did. It's because of what God did. I presented myself as a living sacrifice, and God saw fit to accept that sacrifice and begin to transform my life. And it's been an ongoing thing, and it'll continue to be ongoing. And today I stand before you probably as one somewhat transformed, and yet still being transformed. And I hope that many of you are in that same state, being transformed, having begun transforming. Not by your efforts or your will or your demands or your pride, but by God's work in your heart. And yet still so many patterns of this world remain. They're deeply ingrained. In many ways, my mind has been renewed, and yet I've tasted the beginnings of freedom and the beginnings of truly following Jesus and really seeing his name made great, and the renewing of my mind to see the world in a fresh, and what 2 Corinthians 5 says is from a heavenly perspective and no longer the worldly perspective, and yet still there's work to do. So let us not be like this world, following a pattern of behaviors, attempting to be good enough, virtue signaling our way to God's pleasure, seeking applause for the good deeds we do in front of people of corrupt minds, no more virtuous than ourselves. Who are we trying to impress with our actions? I told the youth group earlier that when I started out as a youth pastor, much of what I did was to try to gain the approval of the teenagers. Maybe it's just because I've gotten older, but I'm like, I don't really care if I have their approval. I care that they hear about Jesus. I care that their lives be impacted by the one power that can impact a life for real change. I don't need every teenager to like me, but boy, I sure hope they hear about God from me or from someone. But if they're in here on a Friday night, it's going to be from me, and I hope they hear about God and not about me. Why do we seek applause? Or maybe we should cease. That's a better statement. Cease. Stop seeking applause for your good deeds that are done in front of corrupt minds, for people that are no more virtuous than ourselves. Jesus did not only teach simple moralistic teachings. Jesus did not just give us a list of actions to do or behaviors to carry out. Jesus taught submission and obedience to God. He did so in the Garden of Gethsemane. He exampled submission. On the cross and in the resurrection, Jesus paid the justice that is deserved for our sins, and he fulfilled God's mercy that we might have undeserved life. And in his ascension, Jesus sent the Holy Spirit to be the one who would enter our lives and transform our hearts and minds, that we might be able to actually carry out the will of God. So do not seek any longer to do good, but remain trapped in worldly patterns. Rather, present yourselves as living sacrifices for God's use. This is a true act of worship, making his name great. In this, you will be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you might be able to discern God's good, pleasing, and perfect will. And let me end with this. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 20. Therefore reminds us the context. The context is everything I've just spoken. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making his appeal through us. We plead on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. He made the one who did not know sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. This is the message we're to bring. As God transforms us, we are to be this, ambassadors. One of the questions I got on Friday night from a youth, we were doing Ask Anything, so they could ask me any questions. One of them said, is it sin for Christians to break away from the country they live in and set up their own more Christian country? And I might have gotten a little angry when I answered. Might have sounded a little angry. I was just trying to speak through losing my voice. But I very firmly told him that whether it's sin or not is secondary, because it's a complete rejection of what we've been called to be. So I guess it would be sin. It's a complete rejection of what we've been called to be. We are not called as Christians to set up our own little kingdoms and our own little clubs to hide in and protect ourselves from the world. We are to be ambassadors in this world. This is God's kingdom we're talking about, and we are not part of the kingdoms of this world, and we're not supposed to set up our own kingdom in this world to be a kingdom of the world. God has a kingdom in this world, his kingdom that he established. We are his ambassadors. I was supposed to be at my conclusion, but I'm getting fired up again. We're to be his ambassadors, coming with transformed hearts into a world of rebellion and destruction. And we're to bring the plea of Christ, be reconciled to God, step away from your rebelliousness and enter into his kingdom. I sometimes get in trouble for this, but I'm not really Canadian. The teenagers are very interactive, and I really like that, so keep going. It's good. I'm not really Canadian. I live in Canada. I submit to Canadian law. I submit to Canada's taxes and everything else. But I'm a child of God. I'm of God's kingdom. I'm an ambassador here. Whatever kingdom I was in, whatever nation I was in, whatever land I was in, whether it was Canada or Cambodia, wouldn't matter. Because we're to be ambassadors. People bringing transformed lives, living sacrificially for God, making his name great in whatever land we find ourselves in. This is what we are to do. Not putting forward a bunch of behaviors to look good like nice Christians, or hiding inside the walls of the church, safe from the evils of the world. I'm sorry, they're in here too. We are to be people of transformed heart and mind, bringing the message of the gospel that Christ has reconciled man to God by being the one who knows no sin, becoming sin, so that we might become God's righteousness. This is what we're to do. And it comes from a transformed mind that comes from living sacrificially. Let me close in prayer. I went a little long, I apologize. Lord God, you are good, and you have worked in our hearts in incredible ways. And Lord, it seems like the enemy is large, like this huge mountain. The entire world is against it. Our entire world is against us. We send our children into schools and communities and social clubs and the internet, where the world is seeking to conform them and corrupt them. And yet, Lord, it's your power and your will that transforms our hearts. So, Lord, I pray for your Spirit in the lives of each one of us here this morning. Pray for your Spirit in our hearts of our children, in the hearts of our leadership team who's on retreat this weekend. Lord, I pray for your Spirit in my heart, that you would continue to transform us, that we would see this world from your heavenly perspective, and that from a transformed heart and a transformed mind, we would have the courage and the passion and the desire to carry out your will, to bring your word, to be ambassadors without fear in a world that absolutely hates you. Go with us as we seek your will in the world this week.